really want to make a deal. I think they want to die.
That was President Trump reacting to the collapse of the negotiations for a hostage release ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. And reportedly, they fell apart because Hamas is now going back on certain details of the negotiations that were already agreed upon just before the two sides were close to making a deal. Now, in this video, we are going to get into what Hamas's actual strategy is, and it's a smart strategy, so stay through till the end of the video. Now, here is Tamir Morag, chief political correspondent for Channel 14 cable news in Israel, reporting on one of those details that Hamas is changing.
בין היתר, חמאס דורש מישראל לפרק לחלוטין את קרן הסיוע ההומניטרי לרצועת עזה ולהכניס מדי יום לרצועה 500 מסעיות סיוע שכולן יוכנסו על ידי האו"ם או במילים אחרות יגיעו ישירות לידיים של חמאס. זאת בניגוד לסיכומים שכבר הושגו בשלב מוקדם יותר של השיחות, על פי מדי יום ייכנסו 200 מסעיות באמצעות האו"ם ו300 מסעיות באמצעות קרן הסיוע. רק ניתן מעט פרופורציות, לפני המלחמה נכנסו לרצועת עזה 73 מסעיות מדי יום בממוצע בלבד, וזה הספיק על מנת להאכיל את תושבי הרצועה.
So Hamas is demanding that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that's the American organization that is working with the Israelis, distributing at this point over 2 million meals per day to Gazans directly, meaning that they're giving the food directly to the Gazan citizens, circumventing the way that aid was being distributed for most of the war, which is that it would be brought in by UN-affiliated organizations and go right into the hands of Hamas. And we've talked about this many times in earlier videos, and if you've been following the war, you know this, that Hamas has been using the humanitarian aid that comes in as a way of surviving. They take the aid, they sell it at exorbitant prices to the people, they hoard it for their own operatives, their own terrorists. By selling it, they then take the money and they use that to hire new recruits. And basically, they use the aid as a way of controlling the population and maintaining their governing authority. So the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, this new organization that has come into areas under full IDF control and has been distributing aid to Gazans directly for free, is a mortal threat to Hamas. Because if the people of Gaza are receiving aid without having to buy it at exorbitant prices from Hamas, Hamas is deprived both of their cash flow and of their power. So in these negotiations, originally it was agreed upon that 300 truckloads would go in every day to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and 200 truckloads would go in through UN-affiliated organizations into areas that are still populated by Hamas and somewhat under their control. And Hamas now is demanding that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation be completely disbanded and that all 500 trucks per day go into their hands. Now, parenthetically, as Tamir Morag pointed out, 500 trucks a day is far more than enough to feed everyone in Gaza. Before the war, only about 77 truckloads of aid and food were going into the Gaza Strip on a daily basis, and that's how much was being consumed by the people of Gaza. Why is Hamas demanding this? Why is it such an important demand that it's worth blowing up the negotiations over? Well, obviously, Hamas knows that so long as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is at all successful delivering food directly to the people, they're in danger of losing their cash flow and their authority. And that's why Hamas has been threatening Gazans who go to receive food from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. There was a report a couple of days ago that there was a rocket fired from Hamas-controlled territory at one of the distribution sites. Hamas is trying to make it too dangerous to go to the distribution sites to get the food there so that the Gazans don't go there for their food and go to them instead. And then they can control the population and they can also make money from it. So this battle over how much food goes into the hands of United Nations-controlled organizations, which really are working hand in glove with Hamas, versus how much of it is going to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, this American organization with the Israelis, is critical to the whole war. Now, the main sticking point in these negotiations from the beginning has been that Hamas is demanding a commitment to end the war, and Israel refuses to end the war so long as Hamas remains a military or governing entity. Israel's demanding that Hamas be completely disbanded, completely disarmed, and its leadership exiled from the Gaza Strip so that there is no more Hamas. Israel wants victory over Hamas, because we can't have a genocidal organization committed to the death of all Jews in the world still in a governing position in the Gaza Strip. So Hamas believes that if they dig in on this point about the humanitarian aid, that throws them a lifeline. But you might be wondering, why do they think that Israel will ever give up on this demand for them to remain? And this gets into domestic politics. And this is the second factor that's influencing why Hamas is doing this at this time. The number one most contentious domestic issue in Israel right now is what's called the Haredi draft law. And what that refers to is the Haredim, or often called ultra-Orthodox, are parties in Israel that are part of a stream of Orthodox Judaism that does not believe in serving in the Israeli army. And it has to do with their whole theology about the state of Israel. And we're not going to get into the weeds of what that theology is, but this is a segment of the Jewish Israeli population, the ultra-Orthodox, that refuse to serve in the Israeli army. And the question of changing that status quo has been a very contentious issue in Israel for many years, for decades really, but it's very much come to a head since October 7th because the rest of the Israeli public that is fighting this war, and especially you have these reservists, thousands and thousands of reservists who are leaving their jobs and their families for extended periods, fighting the war. The rest of Israel is suffering military casualties on the battlefield, while the ultra-Orthodox community is not carrying its weight, and therefore it's a very contentious issue. Now, the ultra-Orthodox parties form a very important component of Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition. The way Knesset politics work, the way Israeli politics work, is that there is the Knesset, that's the legislature. There are 120 seats in Knesset. And in order for the government to continue to function, there has to be a coalition that is at least half of the Knesset. So there's a majority, meaning you have to have 61 Knesset members who are part of the governing coalition. If the coalition does not have a 61-seat majority, what then happens is that the opposition, which is the majority, passes a vote of no confidence. This brings down the government and triggers new elections. So that's how the coalition politics work. Now, the way parties join the coalition is that in exchange for being in the coalition, they are given control of different government ministries. Up until about a month ago, the governing coalition in Israel had 68 seats, more than enough to govern a pretty healthy coalition. But there are 18 ultra-Orthodox Haredi seats in the Knesset. And what happened 2 weeks ago, the Haredi parties made a decision to resign all of their ministries. So they essentially left the coalition. However, they said that they're still not going to vote for a no-confidence motion. They're not going to vote to bring down the government, but they're surrendering their ministries. Now, why would they do that? It seems like they would lose from that. They're no longer control ministries, but they're not bringing down the government. But that's exactly the point. The reason they did that is as a very severe warning to Prime Minister Netanyahu, because once they've given up their ministries, there's no longer the incentive for them to hold the coalition together. Or to put it another way, there's no longer a disincentive to vote for a no-confidence motion. So it was a way of putting Prime Minister Netanyahu on notice that they have one foot out the door of the coalition. And if they vote for a no-confidence measure, the government will fall and Israel will go to new elections. To make a long story short, the fact that the Haredi ultra-Orthodox parties have resigned their ministerial posts makes Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition weaker now than it has ever been. One could say that it is a hair's breadth away from absolute collapse. So Hamas believes, and they're not wrong, that if they just wait a little longer, if they can push these negotiations down the road, if they can buy a little more time, they could realistically live to see the point where the Netanyahu government falls. And whoever would replace Netanyahu in government, they would argue, would be more amenable to doing a deal with them. And if you take a look at the Israeli opposition parties who have been anti-Netanyahu all along and have been critical of his handling of the war and critical of his handling of the negotiations, Hamas is probably right. Any government not led by Prime Minister Netanyahu in the Israeli landscape would probably give Hamas a more favorable deal. So that's part of why Hamas is doing this. So when President Trump says
Hamas didn't really want to make a deal, I think they want to die.
His envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, is expressing frustration that Hamas is being unrealistic in their demands. Understand that Hamas is actually being very rational. They see a light at the end of the tunnel if they could just survive long enough to see the Netanyahu government fall. And this has everything to do with the third factor that is playing a very important role in Hamas's behavior, and that is the very successful propaganda campaign that Hamas has waged over the last few weeks, arguing that there is a famine in Gaza. So in the earlier part of the video, I talked about the fact that Hamas wants to control the humanitarian aid, but Hamas has also promoted the idea that there are famine-like conditions in Gaza. And we've discussed this in some earlier videos. The previous video that we released just at the end of last week, we talked about this in detail. But just to sum up the key points, last week, Israel released drone footage of 1,000 truckloads of humanitarian aid. That's enough to feed the entire Gaza Strip for 2 weeks. 1,000 trucks of humanitarian aid sitting on the Gaza side of the border in areas that Hamas still controls that had not been picked up and delivered for weeks. No one was coming to get it. And meanwhile, Hamas and UN organizations, international organizations, have been screaming that there's a famine in Gaza. And once the Israelis released the drone footage that we showed you in the previous video of these 1,000 truckloads of humanitarian aid just sitting there, after that was released to the public, lo and behold, over the last few days, the UN organizations have been collecting that food and starting to distribute it in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. They were kind of embarrassed, humiliated on the world stage when everyone saw that the whole famine narrative was a lie. So this famine narrative, which has been working really well in world media, you see headlines everywhere about the starvation in Gaza. If there are Gazans who are starving, it is only because the United Nations, in cooperation with Hamas, have been withholding food from them. By withholding food from them and amplifying this starvation narrative, they push the idea that the new distribution system for food that Israel and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation have implemented in the southern part of the Gaza Strip is actually not working. By promoting this false narrative that it's not working, they put more pressure on Israel to change the way they're delivering the aid and to go back to the old system where the aid goes through the UN organizations right into the hands of Hamas. So that's Hamas's strategy. Amplify the starvation narrative, placing more pressure on Israel to either increase the amounts of aid going into Hamas's hands or completely dispense with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. At the same time, they're making that a demand in the negotiations to get rid of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. At the same time, they are threatening Gazans who go to receive food from them. If they could just get rid of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and take control of all the aid coming into the Gaza Strip, which is aided and abetted by this fake starvation narrative, which puts greater and greater pressure on Israel. All of this weakens Israel's position at a time when the Israeli government coalition, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, is hanging by a thread. So that is Hamas's game plan. So as much as President Trump is expressing this frustration and saying that, they just want to die and they're changing the terms of the deal, there's a very good reason Hamas is doing it. Hamas is digging in on their position because they see weakness on the Israeli side. They see their propaganda campaign about starvation working. They see a possibility of regaining control of the humanitarian aid, which opens up their cash flow and their power, and they see the possibility of bringing down the Netanyahu government. All of these things combined led Hamas to the conclusion that they're better off not making a deal now and delaying further into the future.